What have you got to start off with?
Hello again, Claire. Let's start with Iraq. As we've been saying in bulletins all morning, US President Barack Obama met the Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki in Washington yesterday and promised to stand by him as the US, of course, pulls its troops out of Iraq by the end of this year. But the Washington Post says the president is putting too positive a spin on what's still really quite a bleak situation on the ground. They say that Obama said 5 times in yesterday's speech that the war in Iraq is ending, but they reckon that's contradicted by the reality on the ground, where al-Qaeda-linked terrorists are still carrying out attacks. And they also say al-Maliki might not be the best ally for Washington to tie its colours to. They say that his government is questionable in several ways. They say that he's arrested 600 former Saddam Hussein supporters secretly over the last couple of months and had a number of them arrested. They accuse him of having invented coups or rather invented coup plots to try and crack down on his own political opposition. And the New York Times, of course, also is looking at this today. Their correspondent in Iraq says that the situation is much more complicated than Washington says that it is, that it's foolish to try and paint this as a victory as US troops pull out, much as that's necessary for Barack Obama on a domestic political level, of course, to try and put a good spin on this. They say he's really not in good faith, according to the New York Times, what he was saying yesterday.
What are the papers making of this new candidate in Russia's presidential election, this billionaire that's ready to go up against Vladimir Putin?
Yes, Mikhail Prokhorov is his name, and he's, as you said, the 3rd richest man in Russia, and he owns the New York Nets football team. He's better known as a playboy than a politician. There he is drinking champagne with Jay-Z in New York when he bought that basketball team. But the paper says he might, in fact, be a sort of front created by the Kremlin to try and create an outlet for that middle-class anger with Vladimir Putin. They get that idea from some words said by Vladimir Surkov, who apparently is a secretive Kremlin official thought to be in charge of Putin's propaganda effort. He apparently said last week that what the government should do is create a party to attract all of those liberal votes who are upset with Putin, but which wouldn't actually provide a real threat. Now, The Independent reckons that Prokhorov has been picked by the Kremlin to be the face of that party.
Now, yesterday you were telling us about the cautious reception that a deal struck in Durban on climate change was getting. Today's papers are looking at the challenges that lie ahead.
Yes, there's plenty of coverage of this in here in today's Guardian, where they say after this kind of happiness that some deal was reached at the weekend, they're starting to realise just how complicated this is going to be to create any kind of deal by 2015, the deadline set at the weekend. They've got quite a nice summary of those challenges. They include the amount of money that developed countries are going to give the developing ones to try and help them adapt technologically to climate change, the idea of also historical equity. That's the idea that developed countries should take more of a cut in their carbon emissions than the developing ones because they bear more responsibility historically over the long term for having polluted the West. And that's going to be the really tricky point, they reckon, in the upcoming months. It's going to be how much of a cut China and India are prepared to take on their own emissions, or whether or not they're going to stand behind this idea of historical equity and go, well, we didn't create this problem in the first place, so we shouldn't have to cut.
And what do the papers make of that then, this deal between China and India?
Well, the China Daily points out, it makes exactly that point really. They say if they're asked to make the same kind of scale of cuts as developed countries, then millions of Chinese people living in poverty just won't be able to improve their lifestyles, because that takes energy, of course. And the Times of India also makes this point probably even more strongly, saying that without this idea of historical equity, the negotiators would be signing away the livelihoods of 1.2 billion Indians. So quite a reluctance to cut emissions on the part of that Indian paper there. And it's not only the developing countries that are reluctant. Canada, of course, has announced that it's going to pull out of the obligations that it has under the existing Kyoto Protocol. And the Canadian Huffington Post accuses their government of being corrupted by the lure of tar sands. Those tar sands, of course, which are in the north of Canada, are one of the most expensive and energy-intensive ways in the world of getting hold of oil. But the Canadian government has invested a lot of money in them.
So some pretty bleak news for green activists, but you've got some good news for animal lovers in Scotland.
Yes, Edinburgh Zoo's giant pandas, the first in the UK for nearly 20 years, went on show to the public yesterday. There they are, looking rather adorable. Now, The Guardian calls them already the most A-list animals in Britain, saying crowds of paparazzi greeted their first public outing yesterday, and the zoo has already sold 10,000 advance tickets. So the Scottish Prime Minister Alex Salmond's panda diplomacy efforts, as it was called by the press, obviously have paid off quite well for Edinburgh Zoo.
Absolutely. A-list celebrities, they're being called. I like that. A-list animals. Right, thank you very much for that look at the international press, Elena Casas. Let's now take another look at our headlines before we move on. More than 5,000